Welcome to another episode of 30 Minutes in the New Testament. 30 Minutes in the New Testament is a 1517 podcast network podcast. So you can go to 1517.org/podcast to check out all the other podcasts that are living over there. While you're over there, make sure you check out everything else that 1517 is doing. All the other podcasts, all the articles, all the videos, the academies, the events. I mean, it's a lot going on that website. You can spend some time clicking around that website, finding all kinds of theological resources for yourself, and it's not going to cost you anything. You're just going to be over there clicking around, absorbing content. And while you're doing that, though, you can go over to the donate link and keep it all free, keep it all available to everyone by becoming a contributor. So you could click that donate link, become a reoccurring donor. We'd appreciate that very much, and thank you very much to those of you who do that. You make all this possible. Guys, we are in Matthew chapter 13. We are right in the middle of parables. Jesus is getting the parables going. And we got the parable of the sower. We got the parable of the wheat and the weeds. And now we're going to get to the parable of the hidden treasure.
Indeed. We're continuing on with the kingdom parables as they're sometimes categorized. It says in verse 44 of Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. So clearly what these parables are teaching us is that if we are to obtain the kingdom of heaven one day, if we are to enter eternal life, then we must sell everything we have. We must be willing to sacrifice everything we have. And if we do not, then the kingdom of heaven will not be ours.
Well,
maybe something else.
Let me tell you a little story here. First Bible that I was ever given, which is great. I got this Bible. I was young. Got my first real deal, like big kid Bible. This isn't like, no picture Bible, no like teen youth Bible. This was like the real deal, New King James Bible. And in the cover, it was written by the person that gave it to me. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose, which is a quote by Jim Elliot.
Jim Elliot.
Yes,
yeah.
Jim Elliot said
Very
that.
famous.
And, of course, Jim Elliot went and got speared to death as a missionary.
He did?
So it's especially sort of impactful coming from him, right? This is a guy that, let's just say this guy practiced what he preached in an extreme way. So he went to some jungles, tried to bring the gospel to people, and they said, no thanks, and they stuck him full of spears. And so, yeah, he gave what he could not keep, no doubt, I have no doubt that he did gain what he could not lose, but I wouldn't say that he gained it as much as already had it. And but I didn't know that then. I also grew up reading, having lots of great things read to me, which was Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Little House on the Prairie, all these things. And also mixed in with that was the Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is like traumatic reading when you're a kid. So you're just getting like all these
yes, it is.
horrific stories of like, hey, this is how the saints before you all suffered and died in the absolutely most horrific ways possible.
Yeah, in that book, you're introduced to so many different methods of torture that you didn't even know existed. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's for real demonic. Like where you're like, you can't. You're like a demon thought most of these things up for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
And these are all these stories, and you're like, man, these people are really willing to give up everything. Jim Elliot, these stories of the saints of long ago that were willing to give up everything. And this all then fed into this sort of a theological understanding that this is potentially what it costs. And now this isn't to say that Christianity might cost you your life. It certainly might, and historically has. But when you run across a parable like this, and then you have all of this rattling around in your head, and you hear, okay, you're going to give up everything to possess this treasure of Christ. This can cause some real anxiety, because in my mind, some people have given up extreme things, not just their life, but like torturous deaths and all this stuff. And you do start to then wonder, am I willing to do that? Is that what it takes? Is it a willingness to do these things? And that's how I understood this parable for the longest time, of like, yeah, potentially this could be the reality for you, that it could cost you everything if you actually want to walk through heaven's gates.
Well, and there is too, I mean, there's passages where Jesus does call us to pick up our cross daily. There are passages that we are called to sacrifice for the good of our neighbors, and, you know, like the Jim Elliots of the world have done. I mean, so it's understandable, again, that like when you come to this parable, you automatically assume that the subject is you. And that's the first problem, because if we're just doing good interpretive work here, we have to read this in the context of the rest of the parables. And when we do that, we find that the subject, of course, is Jesus.
Yeah, and this is the important thing, is that I don't say any of that to minimize any of those stories, because, and of course, realistic ways, they're very admirable stories, and like there's a lot of courage and a lot of faithfulness.
Absolutely.
There. However, the difference is that for someone like Jim Elliot or like the martyrs of old, you don't endure martyrdom and then gain heaven. You go through martyrdom and enter what you already have, your inheritance, what you've already possessed.
Yes.
And Jim Elliot doesn't go and get speared to death on a beach somewhere, and because of that now gains this other thing. He goes to the beach and does that. He already has it. That's already his, because of what this parable is actually about.
You guys spent much more time in your youth reading stories of and understanding stories of martyrs and great Christian heroes than I did. This much is obvious, first of all. Secondly, I think with all of these parables, Eric nailed it. And just, we have at the core of our misunderstanding of parables is a grammatical issue where we don't understand that when Jesus is telling these parables, he's telling stories about him. We're in there usually, or you as the faithful, or as the one chosen, or the one found, or whatever. You're in there, but you're not the one that's typically doing the positive work for salvation, or ever doing the positive work for salvation. And once you can sort of flip that off, these open up a little bit more. I mean, you and Eric, in your book and other places, have provided even more color to this particular parable that is just fun and interesting and makes it more meaningful to the modern reader, just because it was probably understood better to the original reader, what the context that you guys give and the way you explain it. But yeah, this isn't about you giving up everything. This is about Christ giving up everything for you. And that's just clear. Now, again, that doesn't mean that, because you're a Christian, you might not be called to do something very dramatic like that, and very meaningful and impactful, and even up to the point of martyrdom. Some people are. More and more people will likely be as the proclamation of the gospel goes out into a progressively more secular world. But that's not what this parable is about.
Yeah.
Yep. Amen. So, I mean, just to kind of summarize what these two parables are about is the treasure hunter and the pearl hunter, or the merchant, is Jesus. The treasure then is those who believe, his church, and the field here that he's bought, because remember, he didn't just buy the treasure, but he ends up buying the whole field, then would be the world. And so Jesus is telling us here that you are his treasure, you who believe are his treasure. Now that fits perfectly well with what we hear about Jesus in Hebrews, who were told for the joy that was set before him, he endured the scorn of the cross, the pain of the cross. That's what he does. He does give up everything in order to have the treasure of his church, and yet he also sacrifices so much that he pays for the entirety of the world. He ransoms the world through his life, death, and resurrection. And that's really the point of these two parables.
Well, and here's how you know this. So he's on a string of parables. The kingdom of heaven, this is there's like he doesn't give an explanation of this one. So in the other parables, who is the man? Like in the sower, in the weeds and the wheat. Like the man is him. He's the one.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's the one sowing. He's the man. This one, it doesn't say who the man is, and so immediately we're like, must be me. And you're like, why would that be you? And he just established that in these parables that he's the man. Now, he's going to continue to be the man. He's also established in the parable of the weeds and the wheat, right before this, that the field is in fact the world. Right? I mean, this is consistent with what he's doing. And so it's almost like he had this parable, and he's like, let me distill this down into like this really, really tight parable for you. It goes like this. The way that the kingdom of heaven works, it works like this. It works like there is a treasure that nobody knows about, and a guy, he finds that treasure, and he's not just going to have it arbitrarily. He actually has to go and purchase the whole world, the whole field, this would be the world, and buys it, right? And he does that with joy, even though it's very expensive. And the issue that you'd have, and I think that one of the things that makes people uncomfortable with this interpretation is that they feel some piety in saying, no, of course Jesus is the treasure. I'm not the treasure. Like Christ is always the treasure.
Well,
this feels this is, and by the way, that I understand why that sounds right to you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Like Christ is the thing of ultimate value. Here's
Well,
the
he
thing
is. Yeah.
because of course. But here's the thing that you got to get over. You have to get comfortable with this idea, Christian, that you are what Jesus says you are. That's the way it is, because he also says that you're righteous, and that is in fact going to be the case, because that's how there's this in 40 Minutes in the Old Testament, we're going through the Song of Solomon, and there's this great line, and Song of Solomon, of course, is just this big thing, analogy about Christ and his church and the bride and the groom and stuff. And at one point, the groom, who is Christ, says of his bride something that, of course, is not true of anybody, where he says, you are altogether without flaw.
Yeah.
Now, that might be something that you might say to your wife when you first started dating her, but she knows that's not true. You know that's not true. Like, you're playing this game of make-believe. Obviously, she is not without flaw. But this is the truth, that when Christ says that about his church, it is true, because he has made her flawless. He has given her his perfection. And when he says you are without flaw, that is in fact the case, right? And so here, when he finds this treasure and says that is a treasure, he calls you a treasure, that is true because he has made it true.
I think I think I got this from you guys, but maybe not. The way I teach this now is that the field, yes, is the whole world, but it's a graveyard. And
Well,
if you
the
think
world is a graveyard.
if you
Yeah,
think about
that's
the
right.
world, it is a graveyard. Everything that's
Dead
born,
in
everything that's
trespasses and
planted.
sins.
Well, literally, everything that's born dies. Everything that's planted withers and dies. Everything that's made turns to dust. The whole 9 yards, right? And so it is a graveyard. And so it's kind of, if you are the treasure that's hidden in this graveyard, it means that you're a dead thing. Now that's not like people are like, oh, I'm a treasure. You're a carcass in a tomb. And that's the kind of treasure you are. But what makes you a treasure is the fact that he founds you and values you and then actually calls you a treasure. That's what makes you a treasure. And so when he goes all that he has to buy a field, he's going to give you all that he has to buy a dead thing, that houses dead things. And for the purpose of keeping them, right? And the way that this kind of sometimes comes full circle again is just to point out that he keeps it. Like when he buys this field, he turns it into his church, which is where he keeps you and sustains you with his word and sacrament until he comes again to bring you to himself.
Yeah. And yet that doesn't mean that all of the parts of the field, all of the carcasses of the field are necessarily going to acquire the kingdom of heaven, so to speak, or that they're going to receive the word that they are the treasure. that they are going to receive the word that they have been declared righteous. There will be some that reject that. And that leads us into the next parable, where he says in verse 47, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good in the containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it's almost like on the heels of this parable where it makes it sound as if everyone is going to be sort of scooped up into being the treasure because they've been bought. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to receive that declaration or everyone's going to receive the fact that they have been atoned for or bought. And we see that illustrated here with this parable, in which we're told again that at the end, no, there will be a sifting. And, you can even apply this parable about the gathered fish to the church, that there's going to be in the church, like in the wheat and the weeds, there's going to be people that we don't know whether they're believers or not. They attend, they go, they're part of the church. We don't know, but the Lord knows. And at the end of days, there will be the sifting. Those who believe will be declared righteous or are declared righteous, and those who reject what Jesus has done for them, the buying of them, they will be declared evil and then separated into the different places they'll go.
Yeah,
so
this righteousness is for sure a declaration kind of thing. I mean, like you said,
100%.
You're purchasing this dead world, and then you create treasure out of it. There's this in First Peter, like Peter uses this kind of language. If you're struggling with this idea of like how much God values you, because I understand it. Why would he? You don't seem that altogether valuable, but Peter says that you're speaking of people, right, of the church, that you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that there's something that God possesses. And this is all to proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into light. So who did that work? He's the one that calls you out of that. And you were once not a people, but now you're God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And so there's this cool thing that happens all throughout the Bible where God is ecstatic with his own things. This happens at Genesis, at the very beginning, where God's creating things, and it's like, man, that's good. Oh, that's really good. Oh, I like that. And it's just like stuff that he's creating, and he's saying, this is all so good. Then he's looking around the earth later on to see like who will. He's like, I love faith. It's the only way to possibly please me. You could never please me without faith. It's the only thing that makes me happy. He looks all over the earth. Will I find faith? No, I'll find none. So what does he do? He like deposits faith into people. He creates it and gives it to them, and then says, "Man, that faith is awesome. This is the best faith." That's like at one point we did this text early, weeks ago. So Jesus is like marveling over the goodness of the thing that he created. Find some guy that believes and is just in awe of this faith that he created. It's awesome. And this is how it always goes. And then he says, I need people to be righteous. Oh, there's no one righteous. No, not one. I'm going to impute righteousness to them. And then says, now let me separate everyone according to whether or not they're evil or righteous. He's like, man, they're righteous. These people are so very righteous that they're going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. This is just God being ecstatic over his own gifts.
I think these 4 verses are, you have the actual parable and you have the explanation of the parable, like all wrapped up into sort of one telling. And there's 2 parts to the parable. There's sort of the gathering and the sorting. One of the things to notice about this is that in this instance, if I'm right, and Jesus, when he says the kingdom of heaven is like, he's describing himself, he's actually describing himself as the net. Like he's, and this is true of what we think about the gospel.
Gathering up people.
Well, it's true what we think about the gospel, that when we're preaching the gospel, we're actually preaching Christ. And that sounds like metaphorical, but in a sense it is, but in a sense it's really not. We actually think that Christ is being delivered to people, and faith is being given, and the whole 9 yards when the gospel is preached. But what I like about verse 47 is that it's just thrown, right? It's not it's not like a bow and arrow, and it's not like picking a target and hitting it. It's a net that's thrown in, and it's scooping up everything when it comes up. And then you worry about the sorting later. And that's what happens here. And then that's also the explanation. It's just relating this sort of picture of fishermen and fish throwing out a net and gathering all sorts of fish to you proclaim the gospel, you go evangelize, you feed the church through word and sacrament, and you don't worry at the end of you let God do the worrying about what is happening in the heart. But you just keep doing what you're doing. That's giving Christ over. And at the end of the age, God will take care of what he is determined to take care of.
Yeah. And it's important to point out here, too, this is, again, another pretty clear allusion that Jesus is going to not just be the Messiah for the Jews, but he's going to be the Messiah for the Gentiles as well, because he's gathering fish of every kind. He's gathering people of every kind, not just descendants of Abraham, but of every kind, and from every background, and from every kind of sinful pattern of behavior. He's just gathering, Christ is gathering them all up through the preaching of Christ.
You know, to that point, guys, like Scott, when you were saying that, this reminded me of when Jesus first calls Peter, right? And Peter's just like out on a boat doing some fishing and not catching anything. And then he's got this rabbi that's out there and say, hey, why don't you throw that net over on the other side or whatever? And he's like, yeah, all right, listen, I do this professionally, so
you stick to preaching, Rabbi.
Yeah, if you think I didn't try the other side, I did. I've been out here all night, but whatever, I'll do it. And he does it, and then they have this massive haul, and they have to get the other boats have to come and help them haul it in, all this stuff, right? Massive haul of fish, and that's when Jesus says after that, he says, "Hey, how about this from now on? I'm going to have you do that with men."
Men, yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's not an accident where it's you're gonna just throw it out there and fill it up, and there's gonna be these massive hauls. We're gonna do that with preaching. That's how it's gonna work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this again is reminiscent of the parable of the sower, liberally throwing out Christ, and Christ is going to cause growth. He's going to bring in people constantly. The sorting, that's up to him. We just faithfully keep on doing that, faithfully keep on throwing out Christ to the world.
That's it.
Verse 51, have you understood all these things? And of course, because they are who they are, they say to him, yes.
That's my favorite part.
This is reminiscent of ancient Israel after Moses delivers crushing law, to them, just law after law after law. And then he says, will you agree to do all these things? And unthinkingly, like the disciples here, they're like, yes. Absolutely.
Have you ever been very? I don't experience. Well, maybe with my grandkids, experience this anymore because my kids are grown. But when my kids were little, have you ever come home, and it was just one of those days, and you kind of they didn't clean their room. They're getting in fights. Mom's had it, right? And you just sit them down on their bed. You have 3 boys, so you can just take them all into the one room. You sit them down on the bed, and it's tall, medium, short, and you're just you're giving them the lecture, trying to explain to them all the reasons why they should have done this and they should have done that and they should have understood, and if they just blah blah in the future. And then you give the classic dad line after 30 minutes of lectures to people who can't pay attention for more than 30 seconds. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? And they say, yeah. And for a fact that that you just wasted a half an hour.
Yeah, and then a minute later, they're back to fighting about the toy.
Yeah, that's what I feel like this is like.
Yeah, well, what's hilarious about this, too, is that when Jesus asked them, you understand these things? They're like, oh yeah. Yeah,
of course.
We understand it. Then he
Totes.
says, then he goes oh yeah? Try to understand this.
Yeah,
and then
good luck.
This is just some calling the bluff.
He says to them, therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old.
Yeah, okay. Dude, that's
maybe not. Maybe we don't understand everything.
That's definitely what's happening here. Jesus is like, oh yeah, you guys got it. Try this one on.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny.
Yeah, and I think that the meaning is kind of clear, but as far as what he is saying, the person who's been trained for the kingdom, he's going to be bringing out treasures new and old. That's true, by the way. If you're reading the Word of God, and you're gonna find treasures all the time, like the scribes were constantly doing. They're constantly trying to, copying down the Word of God, and so we We all know this. If you read the Bible regularly, you see a different thing, even though you're reading the same passage, all that kind of stuff. But they didn't know that. I mean, they must have just been like,
if he just said this to me after, long spew of parables, and then he's like, do you understand this? And I'm going to do just like what my kids would do. Like, yeah, of course, man. And then he says this, I'm going to be like,
Yeah, because I like that he doesn't explain it either, or
is
ask
mom
them.
working on dinner? Like, because I'm hungry.
They're just the disciples are just left mulling this one over together. Like, what? I'll tell you what I think this is, though. So we've had you have the parable of the sower, and he's sowing. You have the wheat, the weeds. So you don't get to decide who a believer is and who it isn't, and you don't get to judge them by outward appearances, and that's not how you determine who has faith. You have this is what the kingdom of heaven is going to be like. The way it works is that the Son of Man comes and he gives up everything to purchase the world. And then at the end of the age, of course, he's going to separate everything. Your role in this is also going to be to cast the net of Christ out into the sea and gather up all these people. The way that all of this sort of preaching and proclamation is going to work is this way. You're going to be like a scribe in this sense, that you are going to need these two words to do this. You're going to need an old word, and you're going to need a new word. You're going to bring out of the treasure of the Word of God two things, an old word, which is the law, and a new word, which is the gospel. And this is how this fishing, this sowing, all of this is going to take place.
I mean, that's pretty good, Dan. I'm gonna. That's pretty good.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I really do. I mean, because you're bringing out of the treasure what is new and old, and the treasure for a scribe, of course, is the Scriptures. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, speaking of that,
these scribes weren't great at bringing that new one out.
Yeah.
They weren't.
Matter of fact, they never did.
No,
they just had the old word.
And even that old one, Jesus had to go. As we went through the Sermon on the Mount, even that old one, Jesus is not quite right.
Yeah. When that new word showed up in the flesh, their first response was, "Kill him."
Yeah.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah. Kill that word. Yeah. So you'd think, after telling all these parables, that Jesus is going to go on a tour of great popularity, but not so fast, my friends, because verse 53, it says, "And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished, and said, 'Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?' And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household.' And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief." Well, this is them basically alluding to the fact that Jesus doesn't seem like, they knew him. They knew him when he was a boy, or they knew him when he was young. They knew his family. They knew where he was from. So why in the world should they take him seriously? And so they took offense at him. So they can discount, this is actually a pretty common trick that people can play. They can discount what he's actually saying and what he's actually teaching by just going back to his family of origin and saying, we know him. He's not anything special. We don't have to take him seriously.
This is how people attack arguments in every age. We see this a lot in our age.
Yes.
Go after the credentials. Do you have the background to actually be an authority on this? I'm not going to deal with whether or not you're right or wrong, whether or not what you say about the Scriptures is right or wrong, whether or not what you say about the law or the gospel is right or wrong. I'm just going to attack your credentials. And this is why it starts out with not just who his family is, but what his actual vocation likely was before he began preaching, which is this not the carpenter's son? In other words, is this not a carpenter? What's going on here?
And they have to acknowledge that he's got wisdom and he's doing mighty works. So it's not like they can deny what he's actually doing.
I'm not going to say that we've seen
They have to do credentialism.
I know the three of us have seen this lately in our sort of some of the historical, political kind of podcasts we follow. But let's just say this is what's done now is nothing new, obviously, because, is that person really a historian? Is that person really a doctor? Is that person, can they know anything about, what is the right thing to do when you get sick, or if you have some sort of illness, or is historical interpretation? That's not what their actual specialization is. This seems like it was a highly specialized culture. We kind of got out of that a little bit, but we currently live in a highly, highly specialized culture. So this should be familiar to us. The other thing I always notice when we read this passage, and then I'll be quiet, is, man, they did not have a lot of names. Holy cow. Just like, if you were a James, you knew a lot of James. If you were a Judas, you knew a lot of Judases.
If you were a Mary, there was no other girl's name, apparently.
Yeah. Like, my goodness. All right.
Yeah, this is true.
Well, and I think this is true too, Scott, and without going too deep into it, but like the pushback against the gospel, you might say, like, you got to realize here, this isn't saying that we've seen Jesus' family and they are concerned about him. They're a little nervous, but they're not, like, there isn't like some outright rejection happening from them at this point. But he is rejected in his hometown, and you have to know that, if you're going to really go hard with the pure gospel, that sort of the place that you're from, the place that feels like your home, that should be sort of your home base, won't necessarily like be cheering you on.
Yeah, we've never felt that. I've never felt that.
I'm sensing a hint of sarcasm in your voice, Scott. Yeah. Yes.
That's just something that you shouldn't. I think when you read this part of this narrative, that should inform you to not be surprised when that is the case.
Yeah. Do not be surprised.
Yeah.
If you read it,
and yet don't stop throwing out the net.
Yeah.
Like, don't get discouraged from throwing out the net, folks. The fish will be gathered.
If you read it backwards, you can kind of say, your own people, if you're preaching the gospel, your own people are going to fight it first, and what they're going to do is they're going to go after your credentials and your history.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to do. And that's how it's going to work.
Yeah.
So, and then you make a
just
decision.
stick to preaching Christ.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Well, that's it, man. We are past time, so we gotta wrap it up. We'll be back to go over chapter 14. We're gonna have to say goodbye to John the Baptizer, and Jesus is gonna do a little feeding people. People are hungry. He's got it taken care of. We're gonna get into that next episode. I'll see you guys then.
All right. See you.